I am Cynthia Cook, Senior Fellow and Director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group here at CSIS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to a discussion of current challenges in the defense industrial base. This panel was designed to focus on the challenges of building large systems in factories. Other sectors like shipbuilding and microelectronics have different issues and are worthy of separate attention. So here today, our focus is the factory. My guests are Mr. Frank St. John, the Chief Operating Officer of Lockheed Martin Corporation, which is the United States' largest defense contractor, and is responsible for a wide range of defense capabilities, including the F-35 Lightning II fighter. Next to Frank, I am pleased to welcome Ms. Amy Gowder, who is the President and CEO, Military Systems Operations, General Electric Aviation, which manufactures a range of aircraft engines, including the F-414, which powers the F/A-18EF Super Hornet fighter. Finally, we welcome Mr. Gordon Stein, who is the Vice President and General Manager for U.S. Operations for General Dynamics Land Systems, which delivers ground combat capabilities, including the Abrams tank and the Stryker armored fighting vehicle. So a good range of capabilities represented here on the panel today. Manufacturing defense systems is a complicated endeavor in the best of times. Understanding the requirement, developing new technologies, managing an expert workforce, bringing together a nationwide network of suppliers and subcontractors are all necessary to deliver the capabilities on which the nation depends for its defense. Different times offer different challenges. The context for our discussion today relates to current stressors on the industrial base, which are unique in recent history. The COVID-19 pandemic certainly had a significant impact on the workforce and the supply chain, and a year ago we would not have met in person here at CSIS. More recently, the significant arms transfers sent to Ukraine to help that nation defend itself against Russia's aggression have revealed the urgent need for U.S. defense manufacturing capability at scale. In partnership with the U.S. government, the defense industry has embarked on a multi-year process to backfill transfers to Ukraine. These crises show constraints in defense production relating to surge capacity and resiliency made more acute by three interrelated challenges which we'll cover today. These relate to inflation, the workforce, and the supply chain. First, let's touch on the impacts of inflation. Recent price increases have highlighted structural challenges in defense supply chains and the procurement system. What might these increases mean for future policies relating to contract structure, payment terms, predictability, stability, and capacity within the defense industrial base? Are there policies that the Department of Defense can use to protect its own interests while ensuring a healthy industrial base? Second, we'll turn to the most important capacity that any firm has, its expert workforce. The job market is very tight and unemployment rates remain low. Yet the stressors of COVID led to the Great Resignation and higher turnover. Furthermore, years of tight labor markets have intensified the existing challenges, including recruiting enough skilled workers, particularly in STEM fields. Inflationary pressures make this even more complicated. This is a challenge across the whole economy, but are there policy solutions that would help the defense industrial base maintain its capacity to deliver what the nation needs? The final challenge we'll touch on today is the supply chain. Downsides of years of leaning out supply chains were evident from the beginning of the pandemic when there were shortages of consumer and industrial goods. Industry is eager to partner with the government to ensure resilient and secure sources of critical materials and electronics, while also ensuring there are policies in place to support suppliers at every tier and of every size. Changes to progress payments, which were begun under COVID-19, offer an example of how targeted supply chain support can assist critical smaller defense industrial suppliers that otherwise might have faltered or fallen out of the supply chain. Are there other policies that might help? So we are in a time of challenges, and we have three really difficult constraints to deal with. So hopefully our panelists today will cast some interesting light on these issues, and I'll now open the floor to them. I would like you to offer some opening thoughts on the following question. Which of these challenges has been the most difficult to deal with? Over which one of them do you have the most control? And are there any lessons from the past that might inform how you address the current challenges today? Let's start with you, Frank. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Amy and Gordon, for joining today. And the issues we're going to be talking about today are really shared across the defense industrial base. We were talking in the green room getting ready, and we realized that there really is no one in our space that says, everything's fine, I'm good. These are, acute issues, and world events have highlighted some of the fragility of the infrastructure that we have and some of the challenges that we face. And world events are also forcing us to deal with these in an urgent way. We can't afford the luxury of starting a committee and doing a study and maybe 3 to 5 years from now doing something about the challenges we're facing. So we're all in this together, and for that reason I greatly appreciate CSIS hosting this forum. It's important to have these discussions. The question about which of the three are the most challenging is really hard to answer because they're all very interrelated. Inflationary pressures are impacting our supply chain. Supply chain issues are impacting the flow and reliability of material coming into the factories, which then has a follow-on effect in how we deploy our workforce. And so, and then inflationary pressures are also driving wage on the workforce as well. So these things are all very interrelated, hard to separate them out per se. The thing that I would say are the levers that we are most able to put our hands on are the issues associated with workforce. You mentioned the pandemic, and I'm very proud of the way that we were able to prioritize the health and safety of our workforce through the pandemic. We're also able to learn how to be more flexible in job schedules, which has allowed us to retain a lot of folks that otherwise might have left the workforce. We've also seen a change in what we're doing with our benefits and with salaries, and all of those are things that we can kind of put our hands on. Supply chain is a little farther removed, and then inflation is even a little more distant and certainly not something that we can influence. It's more something that we're experiencing together. Amy?
Great, thank you, Frank, and thank you, Gordon. It's a very demanding, very challenging time. There are exciting opportunities that I think we need to factor in as well. So I look at the Army's Future Vertical Lift program and how we're doing an advanced engine for that program using additive. The technologies around CMCs, these new technologies are bringing resiliency to the manufacturing space, which is great, but also brings a shift in how we engage the workforce and bring on skilled technicians as well as engineers. And Cynthia, I think it offers some policy opportunities for a different approach of how we bring in these like additive technologies and doing airworthiness and even the onboarding of these technologies in the program. So, I look at that, and it's very juxtaposed to what we also see in the supply base, where there was a loss of talent, whether it's through the Great Resignation or we've seen suppliers that had a heavy commercial content in aerospace be hit harder. And that loss of tacit knowledge really is impacting the quality output. And so I think the other area we've really got to look at is how do we partner with that supply base to introduce those quality systems that we know works in other industries? How does the government incentivize that? And then how do we partner with those suppliers as they're onboarding their workforce and getting back to supply resiliency? I think stability in the planning is critically important from the U.S. government. In a time of great uncertainty, which we're in, the more certainty in stability and the planning requirements certainly would be a help. So I agree with Frank, they're all very intertwined. New technologies, planning, stability in the supply chain. How do you take the great workforce that we do have, keep them in our industry, and then grow their skills, given many of them are new to the industry.
Cynthia, thank you for hosting us today. I appreciate it. Frank and Amy, thanks for being on the panel. I would echo the same comments. I don't know so much if it was the Great Resignation. It may be the Great Retirement. If you follow what the demographics are, we knew it was coming, right? So it's how are we prepared for the baby boomers exiting the industry? And I'm part of that bubble myself, right? So, but 2 years back, we had the 60-somethings that, man, we all stayed home for a little bit, and that felt pretty good, right? And then you know the millennials are coming up through that process. So we knew it was coming. It's how were we prepared for it? So I think the pandemic kind of highlighted some of these vulnerabilities and gaps that we as an industry, but just broadly here in the United States, needed to face with. It was coming anyways. And you can see the boomers going in a different direction, so it's going to put demand in a different sector, right? But at the same time, we have to deliver products to our customers. So what that means is you have to engage with that talent earlier, the millennials, from that perspective. You have to go into the vocational programs, incentivize it. But that is partnering from that standpoint. I look at this pandemic here, and generally there's a resiliency in our economy and in the defense industrial base. And you can handle maybe 2 problems at once, but 4 are really difficult. Mother Nature gets a vote, all right? We usually can kind of navigate around those kind of issues. You get war, yeah, you can react around war, but it affects you about 2 or 3 tiers down, right? That's where you have your vulnerabilities. And then you have certainly the post-pandemic, I'll call restart. Country to country decided to bring this economy back differently. Not all at once, so it was fractured, right? So you could look at some economic policy. There could be economic warfare at times, right? So we have to react. So you have to look at the dependency beyond even our shores, right? So that's where you really want to examine down to the 3rd, 4th tier and how we're reacting. And there's proactive things that we're doing about that. I mean, just here in our business, we are 86 to 90% of it shored here in the United States. We actually source it in the United States. The balance is off country, but those are bespoke kind of capabilities that we really got to have from elsewhere unless you grow the industry here in the United States. So I think there's a ton of resiliency, but the battle on 4 fronts, I think we can get through a couple. Control, I don't know if we have control of any of them, but the one we control most is the people side. I agree with you, Frank. It's the policies, work from home or the different work environments, the flexibility. Clearly, there are certain job skills that are demanding a different salary. I think software and cyber are really interesting areas to be in, and we obviously have cyber protection needs here in our industry more than anything else. So that's a hot topic, and then of course the skills area, welding's kind of one of those messy jobs, but you got to start that early, right, and bring that talent up and incentivize it appropriately. So thank you.
If I could just follow on, you asked the question, are there lessons we've learned from the past? We've experienced each of these things individually in the past. So we've experienced the same feeling of diminished buying power that we're getting from inflation when we were in sequestration. And we had mechanisms to deal with that and work our way through that. We've experienced ramp-ups due to conflict, like in the Gulf Wars and things like that, and we managed our way through those. We've experienced changes in technology when we went from paper drawings to digital engineering, and we had workforce turnover. The thing that's unique now is that they're all happening at the same time. And so how do you prioritize your response, and which of the levers that you pulled back then now are opposed by other factors within the system? Right. So that's the real challenge, is the amount of it, not so much that any one thing is unique.
You have follow-ons to that? I'm hoping for more of a conversation than a strict Q&A.
Well, I think Frank's right. we have dealt with them, and that's the same point Gordon's making. You know, I think as I look at the workforce challenges, Gordon touched on the vocational, you know, we are seeing, you know, the engineering pipeline is still there, and we are seeing new engineers wanting to come in the industry, but the technical skills and touch labor. So I think that, you know, not everyone needs to go through a 4-year college degree. There are very rewarding technical skills, but we've really got to reinvigorate that pipeline and partnering. I know the Navy, due to shipbuilding, I know we're not talking about shipbuilding, but has started an incentive in the Northeast to try and get that pipeline. I think we collaboratively need to work on those pipeline issues. And then as you shift, you know, from the workforce to the supply base, certainly GE has seen lean be very effective in partnership and creating stability and transparency and integrating the supply chain. And it does come down to raw materials is a particular pinch point, and that's surfaced during this pandemic and during the scale up, whether it be on the metal side with casting and forgings or on the electronic side. And getting that alignment so that they understand the planning is critically important. So I think, but back to Frank's point, how do you tackle these all at once has been the challenge for us.
And to your point, Amy, some of these issues like the microelectronics and the raw materials and even some of the challenges associated with training the workforce, those are areas where government policy can really help the industry. Each of us trying to address those issues independently would be very inefficient and largely ineffective, but where the government can come in with policy and with departmental influence in those areas, it's helping all of us and rising, you know, that tide is rising all the boats.
I just add one too, it's also intimacy down through your supply chain, right? And connecting the dots. But on the front end of the business, as much of this is being telegraphed, right? Knowing that advanced planning and forecast. If you look at the invasion in Ukraine, it was telegraphed months before, if not a couple years before. That should translate to leadership in a broad sense that something needs to happen. And you can safeguard for that, right? The wild card here was the pandemic, right? When everything shut down during all those signals. And it takes risk, all right? You know, management is in charge of managing risk, right? So I know we've done proactively with our supply base, has done those elements and actually put significant risk money out to industry to stay ahead of need, to get in those lead time, get in those queues. We've worked very collaborative with our partners in the defense industrial base to problem solve for supply, right? So it's demand signals on the front end and being able to synthesize those little tidbits of information and then the intimacy down through your supply chain so you can react and actually have the front end, right? So if you looked, it was what, 4 or 5 months ago in May, if you just as an example, I'll offer up, China shut down for the COVID, right? And back in May, if you look at that, and how many unberthed vessels were in the port of Shanghai? Anybody have any idea? 70% of the world's unberthed vessels, rough numbers, okay, were off the shore waiting to be loaded. So let's run that scenario. It opens back up, they fill up, they send them all afloat, right? Where are they coming? West Coast. West Coast can be jammed. Do we have enough trucks to get it all to the spots, right? So they're already, if you look at the transportation industries, we got to go to some of the other ports to offload the ships. So these are cause and effect kind of things, and Frank picked up on what I was getting at there is those 4 dimensions, we can get through a couple of them, but coming all at once, it's about advanced planning and intimacy up and down the chain and working closely with the policymakers on where those things are going to, just give that little bit of edge so we can get ahead of it, right? Whether it's the progress payments, I wouldn't suggest advance payments, but any of those kind of things that we can go do, or a larger buy, a multi-year buy. All right, I know what we've done is we bought next year's already. in advance. 260 systems went out and already procured it just to get it, and that's all on company risk money. We're on the bet that that's going to come. All right, but that takes big kahunas, if you will, by leadership to say, yeah, I'm bullish on it, right? I mean, you're thinking demand signals. If we have to replenish stocks, so that's that risk equation to kind of having those long-term agreements and really moving from contractor to partner. I mean, that's a big movement, right? Mm-hmm. And are we valued as a national asset? Right?
I think the risk part of that's important, right? Incentivizing us to take the risk and not penalizing us for taking the risk for speed.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
So I think that is a great entree to my next question, which is that by some measures, the defense industry is facing real challenge. By others, it's doing great. The profits are in the billions of dollars across the industry. So given that, a critic might point to those and say, why are public policy solutions necessary? How would you respond to that? What could be the role of the government in making sure that the national asset, which is the defense industry, sustains itself through these challenging times? What is the role for smart public policy?
Okay. So first of all, I'll say that a profitable and healthy defense industrial base is a national asset, and that our system in this country, unlike that of our adversaries, rewards risk, rewards investment, and that's why our nation leads the world in innovation in all areas, not just in defense and aerospace. So the profitability that you described is a good thing. And the department should be happy that we're profitable because we're able to attract capital, which fuels growth and funds future capabilities. In terms of where is the role for policy, I think it gets back to the fact that there are things that affect all of us, and the government is more effective in addressing those issues collectively. We're not going to talk about microelectronics, but microelectronics is one. The CHIPS Act was a very positive step in addressing an issue that all of us are impacted by. Policy around rare earth elements, and how are we going to make sure that we're not at risk for foreign supply of those. Policies and partnerships with state and local governments and federal government around apprenticeships for things like cybersecurity and full stack software engineers and next generation digital technology in the manufacturing spaces. Those are all areas where if you look at the supply chain, those are areas that are kind of cross-cutting, and those are areas where government policy is a big benefit. And so we are partnering in those areas with the department. We're happy to see the department moving forward on some of these areas. I don't want to keep listing them because I'll steal everybody else's thunder, but please go ahead, Amy, pick up on that.
Sure, and I think continuing policies around competition, competition drives innovation and a level playing field. I think recognizing when we take total cost or total price reductions and not parsing profit, because we're having to counter inflationary. So to counter, we should be given credit for countering inflation, taking out cost, and still having healthy profit to invest in innovation. I think those are other important policies. The other one would be, as we think about the digital technology, the cyber requirements, again, back to advanced manufacturing, like additive that I mentioned, continuing to recognize the benefits and reward and change the policy of acceptability of some of those components rather going through the old methods of testing. Some of those broad sweeping in innovation are also important.
I'll add to what y'all said here is profits, understanding what profits are used for. Frank touched on a little bit of capital expenditure, right? Plant and facilities. Innovative design and technology. We're really looking for persistent modernization beyond parity. We need to win the battles we get into. Okay, beyond parity. It's not, you don't modernize to parity. So you have to be on the front edge of it, and that takes investment, and that comes back in the form of from our profits and certainly all the risk-taking, because not everything that you innovate and put out there ever goes to production. And that's where you see the return. So it's really fundamentally understanding what profits are used for, right? And then back to shareholders that are really the ultimate risk takers in what happens with what happens in our industry. So I think it's important to understand that little bit of element, but it's about persistent modernization, and you don't modernize to parity. Otherwise, we're trailing the play for our defense forces from that perspective.
So just continuing this just a little bit, are there any particular specifics that you'd like to see either the Department of Defense or Congress to engage in policies that they could change or so forth? I mean, it is the sense of the Congress that ...
Right. So I'd point to a couple of things. One, we talk about in urgent times like we're facing having to replenish stocks for Ukraine and things like that, the need to increase capacity. Capacity is a 24 to 30 month process. There's tooling, there's test equipment, that flows through all the levels of the supply chain. And to the extent that we can get ahead of some of that and prepay long lead elements of the supply chain, over the years, we have leaned out the supply chain and disaggregated and globalized the supply chain to the point where it was very ultimately affordable, but it was also fragile. And counteracting that fragility and creating something that's a little more resilient is going to imply some investment. And if the department could prepay some of the long lead material, we could take a 24 to 30 month surge and turn that into maybe a 12 to 18 month surge. That optionality and those strategic options, I think, are worth the investment. The other thing, this may sound a little, I guess I'd say a little wonkish, but there's a policy now that we are no longer allowed to expense our R&D costs in the year that we expense them. And what that does is that takes those R&D costs and it kind of traps them in our balance sheet and keeps us from being able to spend money on other priorities. And so anything that could be done legislatively to address what we believe is a little bit of a departure from the way things used to be, where we could expense those R&D costs when we spend them, that would be welcomed. And I think it would kind of lubricate the process of investment within the industry.
I'll shift a little bit from just the U.S., but internationally. So, NATO and our allies are certainly facing the same need to ramp up capacity, have resiliency in their own supply base and capability. As we look at some of the export laws and the movement of assets within the NATO region, that can become very cumbersome. And it can frankly inhibit and create long delays in the supply chain. And it makes us challenging for us to partner with the NATO industry because it just adds more complications. So I think as we look to continue to further those relationships, we really need to look at the policy around the efficient movement of assets within a region and the TAAs and the other export licenses that are required. I think it's an area of improvement. The other one, might be challenging, but Congress does need to realize that a CR can create, instability when we have new programs that are delivering important capability and then they can't get started because it's not being funded. They just need to appreciate their responsibility and the impact it has on the government.
I'll echo on what Frank was saying. I think he said it spot on. I think where my head goes is the back end of that. You go up and down, it's how do you sustain it, right? So you want predictability and stability, so once you're up, you want to hit that rate where it's sustainable. And it really goes back to the front end of it's the analytics and the early demand signals Policy can get after the long lead, but then you've got the back end of it. And we go into these troughs and come back, and that's the lessons learned from history. I mean, we dug out of the OIF and OEF, and then you heard about it was called the peace dividend. Well, I don't know about the peace dividend, because the next bad guy pops up somewhere else. And then we go off there, and then the next bad guy, right? So this is persistent. Now, what's the equilibrium point? That's where we've got to really put some analytics around, right? But then you have to sustain it, right? And there isn't necessarily a capacity issue. It's a lead time issue. I point you to the MRAPs, right? Needed them, brought money. There was a lead time away. Absolutely right. 36 months. Boom. Vehicles coming off at rate, right? I mean, it's a matter of a lead time, right? And you can shorten those lead times. So that's spot on.
So among all the other things that would be useful, a good sense of advanced planning and investments in that. Let's turn now to deeper dives into each of the three issues that you've really touched on in an interesting way so far. The first one, inflation, is the context for every other challenge. Over the last 12 months ending in August, consumer inflation has hit 8.3%. The cost of energy has risen 23.8%. Material costs for manufacture have risen 10.7%, and labor costs across the whole economy slightly over 5%. How is your company experienced in handling this challenge? And how can government policy help short of price controls?
So the experience we're having is primarily in two ways. One is on fixed price contracts, where we already have backlog. We're seeing growth in costs, both in material and in labor, and that is, impacting the performance of those programs. The other thing that's probably more concerning is we're seeing a reluctance on the part of our supply chain to engage in long-term agreements. Historically, one of the ways that we've driven stability and encouraged investment within the supply chain and delivered value for the customer is by striking long-term agreements where we felt like we had visibility into demand. So we would sign 3 or 4 year agreements with supply chain, and then those savings would get passed on to the customer as subsequent buys played their way out. What we're getting back from the supply chain now is that there's so much uncertainty in their own costs and their own material that they're unwilling to do that. So that's one of those things, like I was saying, we know how to handle these situations, but now I've got something that's opposing a lever that I've normally pulled to drive value. And so anything that we can work with our program offices in terms of recognizing that uncertainty and building in clauses into the contracts that will allow for adjustment as those prices come into view down the road.
I think that's a great point, Frank, that recognition that there are certain commodities that are more exposed to hyperinflation than others. And a recognition that it's not across the board, but there are adjustments that need to happen as we move forward in the future and things get better or worse is a really important point. And in a similar vein, the small business is also the area where I think the government needs to really recognize on fixed price contracts or suppliers to us on fixed price contracts, they have less resources to be able to handle this. And so to not lose our small business innovation, we have seen closures, and that's a concerning trend. So some recognition of the specific dilemma that a small business is in would be the other area that's critical and important.
Yeah, what was just described there is cause and effect, right? I mean, multi-year deals would absolutely the same thing, and you don't see relief inside your current contract. It affects the behavior going into the next contract. So policy would be EPA clauses, economic price adjustments, but you're experiencing it now, and it's going to shape the behavior going forward, which is counterproductive to our agility and resiliency in the supply chain. And then the supply, small businesses, their balance sheets are a little bit tighter, certainly from their ability to invest or weather these kind of storms, especially workforce disruption or any supply chain disruption. And I think policies around there to kind of augment, in the right focused areas, I think is beneficial as well. But at the same time, what we've tried to do, and I mentioned it earlier, is go out with a buy a year and a half early to bring volume on our own risk money, right? So short of any government policy, because we still have contracts to perform on, we haven't asked for relief, so it affects the performance of the programs. Again, it's what we're trying to do is share the forecast. Very discrete forecast. So every supplier can take that information and translate it into the business, have the discussion to see where we might be able to work with one another, right? And then where we've also been able to do is consolidate across commodities and go to the mills, right? So we've done a lot of, I'll say, customer furnished material, which is you typically don't do, but we're trying to buy in larger lot sizes. And then leverage demand across all the business units, as well as the sharing across other defense contractors, where we're able to go to the market with a bigger footprint. Microelectronics is not part of this conversation, but we're only a tiny little bit of microelectronics compared to the industrial and the automotive and the 5G infrastructure. Just a tiny bit. MOSFETs, for example, if you look up what that is, they're difficult to get. So we have to be united, right? So those are some defense mechanisms to, playing a little more offense rather than defense, right?
I'm happy to talk about microelectronics, just we're not building them today.
No, we're not.
No, we're not. You're using them, they're part of your supply chain.
But we're affected by them,
Yeah,
certainly.
absolutely.
But we're talking about collaboration here, right? And communication, right, across the other contractors as well as the industrial base. That's what it is. You have to talk to solve these problems.
Big challenges there.
Yes.
All right, why don't we turn next to the most important capacity that any firm has, which is its workforce. Talent management is a critically important function of any senior management team of any organization. And there are some challenges that you are facing right now. The overall unemployment rate is 3.7%, which makes it harder to find good people. The manufacturing sector alone has increased over 461,000 jobs over the past year, so there's considerable demand. In the past, manufacturing jobs were considered good jobs. Have things changed? Is it more difficult to recruit and retain workers? Are there policies that can help address these? And I do have a couple of other things that I'll raise that you can address as you discuss this, which is one is the resurgence of unions over the past few years, which are often linked to low unemployment rates. That's a time when unions have the ability to grow. And second, the millennial generation, which was born between 1981 and 1986, and I know there's some of you in the audience. Are you seeing anything different about this generation? They have been variously called lazy and entitled, but also digital savvy, deeply engaged, and eager to make a difference. Have they made a difference? So tell us about your workforces. Amy, why don't we start with you this time?
Sure. So as I touched on, we've been successful in recruiting the engineering talent into the company, although we're competing, across the industry. And what we're really focused on that workforce is retention and making sure they want to stay with this industry. And the flexibility has been important. We do see the millennials do want and have benefited from the flexibility that COVID afforded all of us, or forced all of us to put in place. But they still want the engagement. So we're working on the right balances of that in-person collaboration that you can't substitute for, while still allowing the flexibility for their work-life balance. And I think that's key to retaining. So I think, continuing to support, the virtual policies and those sorts of policies and workforce is important. I think as you look at touch labor, as I said, this is where we're really seeing the challenge, and especially skills like machining, welding, and then the new generation, I think about, some robotic applications and inspection and on the floor is a different skill set, and it takes different training and a different pipeline. So I think focusing on that pipeline across the industry, as Frank mentioned, partnering with the Navy as an example, will be critical. You know, we've had long union relationships in GE, very productive ones, and you know, continuing to collaborate with them on these new skills is really where we're spending our focus of how do we collaborate with them and engage them in that recruiting process, take advantage of apprenticeship programs, be willing to do more cross-training, such that frankly, that's what we hear the workers want. They want to be multi-skilled. They want to work on the newer technology. So I think that's the area we're looking to partner with the unions of how do you encourage those kinds of cross-training and pipeline so that they, again, retain in this industry. The retention problems we're seeing is you know, they want to go to a different industry where there's either more flexibility or they get to continue to learn and grow.
I'd add that we've really embraced the diversity. So I haven't come across a millennial that's lazy, I'll tell you that straight up. So maybe it's the bell-shaped curve and they're somewhere else. We're delighted. We're delighted in our industry because the folks we have are engaging just as you described. And it's that diversity of thought that I think is so enterprising. I think the challenge is to make sure the work environment as we return to the office, that the office is set up so it is engaging, right? And that whole element of the social aspect of it, right? So I think there's, from a facility standpoint, I think how we construct and orient offices goes along with it, along with the flexible policies. So you actually have time away from the office to do some of those other things that enrich our lives, right? And if the work's getting done on a different schedule, I think there's enough for adjustments along that way. So I think we're navigating it as we all come back out of the pandemic. We haven't seen a particular problem because we stayed open. I mean, all of us stayed open and we didn't miss delivery. So the hat's off to the entire team that executed through that. Now it's how do we stay at this capability to surge and bring in other resources into the future. I think there's an element to be spoken about patriotism and what our mission is that's unique to our industry. That's a special person. And those are the people we're looking for from that standpoint. I think certainly in the trades, in the shops, I think it's the early engagement in the high schools and to incentivize. So I think that's where policy would come in big time. So if someone in the STEM or the skilled trades was specifically incentivized up through the ranks, that's where you have to grow that talent. It starts right there in the schools and the homes for our future. That's going to take some time to make sure we cover it. So if you look at the demographics, we got to start now. We just got to start now. So.
I would say our situation is very similar. It's funny, we used to say the millennials are coming. The millennials are here. The millennials are the largest generational demographic in our workforce now. They represent about 40% of our population. And so in terms of how are they contributing, they are doing a significant share of the work, and the success we've had over the last couple of years is due to some highly motivated, not lazy millennials. I think what happens is that folks who apply to work in our industry and in our space, they understand our mission and they have a connection and a desire to contribute to something very significant. So we really haven't seen a challenge in motivation at all. We have, though, recognized that millennials have a different view of work-life balance than someone, say, in my generation, where I just worked, and if there was a little time left over for life, that was my balance. And so we've had to adjust our expectations of, what is the work week going to look like and how much flexibility is there going to be there. And then also in terms of providing those continual opportunities to do something a little different. It's no longer the case where someone is going to stay in the same job doing the same program, say, for a decade. we need to be thinking of every 24 months or so, a new experience either on that program or in a different area. With regards to the represented workforce, about 20% of our workforce is represented. And I just want to echo what was said earlier. These are the folks that really bore the brunt of the critical infrastructure when we didn't know what COVID was. These folks went to work every day, put on their PPE, and continued to deliver for our customers. And if there was a positive that came out of COVID, it was an increased partnership with our represented workforce as we had to, on a monthly and weekly basis, figure out how are we going to get the work done together. And so that relationship has been really strong. And one of the things that we're starting to see now, and again, in partnership with our customers, is how do we fund reskilling and retraining of that workforce to be ready for the digital manufacturing and model-based enterprise tools that are coming into the manufacturing areas. And so those are things where we're partnering with state and local governments, with the Navy and other services, and really trying to make sure that that represented workforce continues to be equipped for manufacturing.
Good, thank you. So there's time for one more question before I'll turn to the audience questions, and we're going to touch on supply chain. But before we do, I want to pick up something that Gordon said on a diverse workforce, diversity of thought. And this panel is about problems in the defense industrial base. Diversity is something to celebrate. So I just wanted to throw that out there and see if anybody had a second or two of things they wanted to highlight with that before I move to supply chain.
That's why I brought it up.
Yeah,
perfect. We've embraced it. So I think we found success there. So I mean, as you coaxed out that question originally, so taking the millennials, like I said, show me a lazy one. I haven't seen one yet in our business. So and anybody that we're hiring, Frank, you tapped on this. It's engaging. We get bright ideas. I mean. It's just making sure that we have the job enrichment and the job scope for a career. We invest heavily in any individual, but you want to make sure you get the whole life cycle of a career, right? And that's really what the fantastic part is. It's just a different dynamic. I'm kind of in the similar age sector, I think I am with Frank. And yes, I work a lot and lose a lot of vacation. But that's just how I am. But yeah, it's changed the way we have to look at our enterprises to be adaptive, right?
And I would add that, historically we've looked at diversity through maybe a gender or race lens, but now diversity includes the multi-generations in the workforce, and it also includes this idea of a hybrid team, where part of my team is sitting outside my office and coming in every day, and part of my team is flexing and working from home. And the thing that we've really focused on with our leaders is not just how do you have diversity, but how do you build inclusion and belonging so that everybody feels like they're part of the team and they can contribute.
I think that's a great point, Frank. So I was just at a picnic, and that was, I was able to see the diversity of the workforce. And it struck me in two ways. We had several retirees who went to the great retirement but have decided it wasn't great for them, so they've come back part-time because they still have more to give. And having them collaborate with another generation, that in itself was diversity. But the richness of that experience of new ideas and then the lessons learned being transmitted was very interesting. But there's also the leader-led aspect. So it takes a leader to recognize that talent and force that or encourage that lessons learned and knowledge transfer. It also takes a leader to demonstrate, back to the career pathing aspect, demonstrate that inclusive and promote diversity. And leaders like myself show that there's someone who looks like them who can have a great, successful career. And so we've seen teams that did have either a diverse leader or a leader who was very intentional about inclusion and diversity, and their team has 30% diverse workforce on it. So we do see leadership as still a very important aspect in this whole topic.
Not just challenges, but something to celebrate.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
our last topic is supply chain. Since we've touched on these before, I'll turn to Gordon first, but these topics are so interesting that we're almost running out of time. So if you could give us some thoughts through the round robin, and then we'll turn to an audience question or two.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Supply chain, I kind of talked a little bit about earlier. But it's about the intimacy. First tier, you're dealing with some larger companies, but I think it comes down to the mom and pops. And I think the interesting dynamic that we're going to face there is the generational handoff. So if you analyze what the mom and pop companies are that support your business, they're at a transition point where dad developed the business over the last 40 years, and there's a handoff to either a son or daughter, or maybe not. And there's a capital investment firm that may buy it, and there's a tier of it. You lose some of that intimacy, so there's some risk in that we're paying particular close attention to, so we can make sure we get our products. And the other concern that we're really watching closely is the CUI and CMMC requirements. They're a little bit onerous. We're going to have some fallout from the industry from a compliance standpoint. It's not that our smaller tier firms are saying no, but they just may not have the skill sets to comply fully. So if we had a single source
Controlled unclassified
right,
information and
the cyber compliance, right? So those are probably the dynamics that are probably really concern us, is the generational pass off from family to family, or it's a sellout, right? A collapse and they may exit the business, but then the CUI and CMMC are their particular concerns. Outside all the other things we've just talked about. And CMMC goes live in the springtime, and if you're not at the required levels, you've got to navigate a mitigating solution. So there's a lot of attention on that, right? And I think that might help a little bit. We got to make it easier to contract. Yep. Would be a thought that I'd leave with you as the two other problems we're trying to think our way through. From that standpoint. Amy?
I think it's a great maybe policy addition, particularly in the small business policy and resource. So as we implement CMMC, very important to cyber controls. We need it throughout the supply base, but small business is going to have a harder time implementing and not the resources. So we do need to be thoughtful in how we roll that out. My supply base, absolutely the intimacy. We're taking the lean approach as getting that emphasis on consistent planning, transparency, as much certainty as we can give them. And then the last is really connecting our engineering. So no longer is it an arm's length or just a procurement relationship with a supplier. It has to be that technical joint problem solving when we get into they've lost the tacit knowledge or they are having a real challenging quality issue, and how do we technically help them get through it.
Just a couple of thoughts in addition. We've been running a pilot on cybersecurity tools that we've provided to about 50 folks in our supply chain. And a couple things we found in that. One is that it was very needed, and they're very grateful for the help in fending off continual cyber attacks. However, back to what I was saying earlier about this is an issue that cuts across so much of the industry. Something from a policy and something from I guess I'd say a government program to help small businesses up their game in cybersecurity is probably going to be required to really keep the enterprise whole. A couple other things, cash flow. During the pandemic, progress payments were increased, and I know from our point of view, we flowed 100% of that down into the supply chain, and we have a stack of testimonials from small businesses that say, thank you, you kept my doors open, you helped me make payroll. So being very careful about what we do in terms of cash flow and making sure that we don't inadvertently create a problem back in those small businesses. And so those are just a couple of additional things to what you guys have said.
Does anyone in the audience have a question? Do you mind standing at the mic so that the folks in the hinterlands can hear you? Right behind you. Thanks.
I apologize for being late. I came down from the Philadelphia region, so Washington traffic hasn't changed. I'm here from a standpoint of not in the wonkish dimension. I'm a retired Army colonel with a National War College graduate and was a lifelong armor officer. There's a question, and I guess there's a couple follow-ons. The 2018 report that's laying on my chair there, this was the one during the Trump administration that discovered all of the fault lines and fractures between procurement, supply chain, material resources, output capacity. Perhaps I missed the surge capacity discussion, but I've done a lot of research. Surge capacity goes back to when Bill Perry was the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Logistics, Technology. That's 30 years ago. And I can run a line through all the commissions, the reports, congressional, GAO, and so forth. I guess I'm angling at what has industry done in terms of correcting as well as working with the department in terms of addressing surge capacity?
Surge capacity, that's a great question. Is there another audience? Can you, since we only really have time for one round, maybe we can, if anyone else has questions, please jump up and add them on.
Sure, Byron Cowan, Capital Alpha Partners. Your companies have a pretty good view both domestically and internationally about kind of best practices in some of these areas. And I just wonder if there's anything you see at a state and local level that might be a good template for what the federal government ought to do, as well as internationally, because obviously there are other countries that are facing these same supply chain workforce issues. Anything that you call out that would help inform the discussion here in Washington?
And one last question, and then you can pick up the one that
Hi, thanks for doing this. Joe Gould from Defense News. In recent weeks, we've seen two pieces of news. The DoD halted deliveries of F-35s after it found raw materials for a magnet in the plane were produced in China. And also the Air Force is probing a fighter jet crash where components in the pilot's faulty ejection seat may have been counterfeit. What's the level of concern right now about counterfeit parts in your company's supply chains, and whether material shortages may be driving that problem further right now? Thank you.
So 3 topics are surge, state and local government policies, and specific direct challenges existing in the right now. So why don't we do one round of answers, and then I think that will bring us to a close. And any closing thoughts too? Frank, you want to start?
go first?
Sure, Gordon.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, thank you for your question on surge. I could speak for us and we'll all comment. We have the capability to surge, but we've also modernizing in our plants. So you have additional capacity from that standpoint. But the biggest thing with surge is that demand signal to what Frank mentioned earlier with long lead materials. Now we've advanced and we're holding additional buffer stocks down through our supply chains where appropriate, where risk and reward are kind of in place. But that's together with our customers, we need to really look closely with, hey, where's the demand signals that are coming back to say, other than putting inventory on a shelf, right? But we have modernized through our plant and facilities. So capability in terms of equipment to produce quicker, faster, more affordably are all in place. So we're modernizing our plants.
Okay, Amy?
Sure, and I'll maybe link the international and local into that surge capacity question. So, there are certainly, I think, UK, Singapore, Australia that do longer term contracting. That certainly allows more stability, and it also gives us more insight to when we need to surge so that we can get ahead of that surge demand. Our funding cycle in the U.S. government, for sustainment anyway, certainly doesn't quite afford us that, but that is a best practice, and we do see the benefits. And state and local government, I can think of Oklahoma and Florida come to mind in particular, the ability to work with them on training grants and the ability to work with them on reduced capital investments and over time exposure to giving us capital to invest and create jobs has certainly benefited the warfighter and lowered our costs, and it allowed us to attract and train talent. So there definitely are models internationally and domestically, and that certainly impacts our ability to surge.
And I would pick up on a couple of those things. So in the cases where we have multi-year contracts, and I'll use the Hellfire program as an example, when we had a 4-year multi-year contract, we made significant investments, and our supply chain made significant investments because we had a long period of time that we could amortize and recover those investments over, and we were able to increase the capacity. We were able to more than double the capacity in the supply chain and in the factory. In terms of models in state and local governments, I would say there are lots of pockets of excellence in the country. So I'll pick on the state of Alabama. State of Alabama funds training for high school graduates in manufacturing skills, and we partner with them, and there's a transition where those graduates from that training program get jobs within our factories, and that eventually comes back as tax revenue for the state. So it's a good deal for them, and it helps create a pipeline for us. Similarly, in lots of places in the country, and I'll use Manassas, Virginia, right here in our backyard, apprenticeship programs, where we're working with community colleges to bring high school students in that have cyber and software skills and putting them to work while they earn their certificates and their degrees. So there's lots of, I'd say, pockets of excellence. What needs to happen nationally is those things need to be scaled up and do something more broadly than just these small individual efforts. I'll lastly touch on the counterfeit parts issue. In a supply chain that is vast and complex, and in some cases, no kidding, 14 or 15 layers deep, guaranteeing the certification of every element of everything that goes into every piece of hardware, and software for that matter, is a huge challenge. And it has been a focus of the industry for decades now, since we first realized that you could counterfeit parts. And it goes all the way to raw materials, as you mentioned, microelectronics. So there is I guess I would say, an enormous and ongoing activity, and it's almost like it was the precursor to cybersecurity. It's the thing that initially was a threat. A lot of investment and infrastructure went into it, and now it's part of how we do business. Cybersecurity is headed in that same direction. It is an acute threat now, but it is going to have to become like counterfeit parts, and that it's just going to be part of the infrastructure of the industry.
I would say the one benefit, because we do see it more in the raw material, the pandemic heightened, the focus on raw materials. So I think you're seeing some of this surface because we are getting deeper ingrained with those raw material providers.
Absolutely.
Yep, it's all about that hygiene, right? I mean, that's what you're talking about. It'll be there forever, but it's there'll be escapes, and it's to limit them. Let's be honest.
All right. Well, we can clearly keep this conversation going for another hour or two, but I will draw us to a close now. Thank you so much for taking the time to address some questions and talk about real challenges and answer the audience questions. This was terrific. Thank you. And so, a round of applause.